From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. A bit of regional science news may have slipped past you last week. You'd be forgiven if you missed the Trump administration's announcement that it is removing federal protections from a bird species known as the lesser prairie-chicken. This bird roams the southern Great Plains, including southeast Colorado. And it makes this sound, known as booming, when it dances as part of its distinctive mating ritual. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's decision to remove threatened and endangered species protections for the bird comes after farming and oil and gas interests complained about those restrictions. Now, sometimes it can feel a little abstract when you hear about a threatened species having its protections downgraded. After all, a lesser prairie chicken just sounds less majestic than a gray wolf, for instance. But today, we thought we'd offer a primer on what's special about this unusual bird and why its numbers have declined in recent decades. David Pawlacki is a senior research scientist with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies who studies and works to preserve lesser prairie chicken populations. He joined me to talk about the bird. David, I want to start with what's unusual about this bird. I mentioned that it makes a sound that's called booming during its mating dance, which is called a lek. What is a lek, and why do you call the sound booming?
A lek is a really interesting cooperative mating system that many birds employ, especially our prairie grouse. What happens is the males gather together in an arena and dance and boom while the females watch the ritualized dancing, and then they select among the males who do the best dancing and the best booming.
Okay.
And a lesser prairie chicken makes a boom by vocalizing and inflating sacs of air in their esophagus. And it's very unusual sound. If you hear this when you're out in the grasslands, you have to stop and listen.
You talked with our producer before the show about how the lesser prairie chicken's movements have cultural significance to some indigenous tribes in the Great Plains. Talk about that a bit.
Yes, it's one of the things I find most remarkable about this species is that it is embedded in the cultures of many of the Plains native peoples. So the Pawnee, the Kiowa, the Arapaho all have a dance that they model after the lesser prairie chicken mating ritual. And so they express this in song and dance. And I find that to be fascinating, and it connects us to a time when the Great Plains was a wilder place.
I'm curious what the bird looks like. Help us picture, how big is a lesser prairie chicken and what color is its plumage?
Well, they are a chicken-sized bird, and they're generally a striated pattern of gray and brown. And both sexes have these yellow combs over their eyes, bright yellow combs. And then when the males are dancing, the air sacs on their esophagus puff up in a bright red color.
And then just to ask probably a really obvious question, is there a greater prairie chicken?
There is a greater prairie chicken just to the north, and there are many more greater prairie chickens.
Well, I want to talk about why the lesser prairie chicken is in trouble. There were once millions of them. Now there are about 30,000 left in the U.S. And I think it helps to understand what their ideal ecosystem looked like a few centuries back. Paint a picture of that for us, David, back when bison still roamed the Great Plains.
Well, that's right. Great Plains once rivaled the African Serengeti in their vast herds of herbivores and intact ecosystems with predators such as grizzly bears and wolves. And so the bison grazed this prairie in a heterogeneous fashion where some places were grazed down pretty low and other places were left with tall grass structure. So around the turn of the century, during the Dust Bowl and agricultural increases during that time, really put a dent in lesser prairie chicken populations. Since then, mechanistic agriculture and intensive agriculture has furthered this decline. And so they have lost approximately 85% of their historical range and have contracted to the panhandle region of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and they still occur in small numbers in southeastern Colorado.
We mentioned the oil and gas industry saying that it has been hindered by protections for the lesser prairie chicken. Why is oil and gas exploration bad for the birds?
Oil and gas development or other energy developments such as wind farms tend to fragment the native grassland vegetation. The species requires large patches of grassland vegetation. So you can imagine oil and gas development happening in the grassland, and it could turn that grassland into something that looked like Swiss cheese. And we've seen through some research that these birds are absent from landscapes that have as little as 10% oil and gas development in them.
There are very few lesser prairie chickens left in Colorado. They're mostly in the southeast corner of the state. Now, I know that you have done some work with farmers on the plains to restore the habitat. What does that work look like?
Well, so sometimes I call these little brown jobs.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is these are the conservation actions that private landowners are implementing on their properties. And these can take the form of conservative grazing management to provide the tall grass structure that these birds need to nest in. And it also involves taking cropland out of production, planting it into grasslands. And this has turned out to be a boon for lesser prairie chicken conservation.
So what does the federal decision to remove protections mean for the birds? And how does that affect your conservation work?
I've worked with the greater sage grouse and lesser prairie chicken, and a removal from the endangered species list is often justified if there is enough conservation efforts that are supporting the birds. However, lesser prairie chickens have a very small range and a very small population size, and so they're highly vulnerable to changes to the environment. And let's say if we have a bad drought year in combination with increasing crop production or something like that, and removal of the conservation actions, then we could have a very negative outcome for this species.
David Pawlacki is a senior research scientist with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. He works to preserve the lesser prairie chicken, which is no longer under protected status after a decision by federal wildlife officials. That audio of the lesser prairie chicken was courtesy of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. We'll have more details about that in our show notes and at kunc.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.